Hi, this is Lisa Maas. Thank you for joining me on this short video about blood sugar metabolism. My goal is that at the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of what blood sugar metabolism looks like in the body, what you should be aware of, what you can do from a lifestyle and nutritional and functional standpoint, and also I feel that it's very important that you understand how your body works so you make better decisions. Some of the terms that we're going to be using might be unfamiliar to you, and that's okay. I don't expect you to know all the terms I'm using, but it's just good to know so that at some point you can intelligently discuss this with me during a consultation or ask questions based on this information and also become more aware of how things work in your body. So let's start. So you can't talk about blood sugar without talking about insulin. Insulin is the most important hormone at regulating blood sugar, and most people think of something like diabetes, either type 1 or type 2, as a blood sugar problem. This is part of the problem, and it's actually a symptom of a problem with insulin. So, in type 1 diabetics, their pancreas is destroyed by an autoimmune process or a virus, and therefore they don't make insulin and they have to take insulin. And in a type 2 diabetic, their body becomes resistant to insulin. So the pancreas does produce insulin, but the cells become resistant to the signal of insulin to take up sugar from the bloodstream. The pancreas therefore has to pump out more and more insulin and eventually burns out, which then causes insulin dependence. So there's type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Both are insulin problems. So insulin starts off by the sensation of eating carbohydrates by the enteric nervous system. Your enteric nervous system is very important. It's one of the main divisions of the nervous system and consists of a system of neurons that governs the function of the gastrointestinal tract. It's very important for overall health and determines how well your body digests and absorbs food. So this is where it all starts. And what happens then is that the enteric nervous system releases glutamate, which is converted into the neurotransmitter GABA in the pancreatic cells, which signals the pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin then acts on the cell walls to open up glucose channels to allow sugar into the cells to be used by the mitochondria to make ADP, which is energy. So insulin basically knocks on the door and allows the sugar molecules to come into the mitochondria, where they are converted to usable form of energy, which is ADP. And this is a very critical step for energy production. Inflammation anywhere in the body can cause insulin resistance. And this is because it gums up that lock, so that lock doesn't open as effectively. And this is due to inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin 6, TNF alpha, NF kappa beta, and so on. And these inflammatory molecules, they block the insulin receptor sites. And there are certain nutrients such as turmeric or curcumin which can actually counteract these effects. So they free up the receptor sites. Here are the signs of elevated insulin or insulin resistance. So these are the signs and symptoms. You see increased weight in the midsection, decreased mental clarity, and we often experience that as brain fog, high blood pressure, joint aches and pains, cravings for junk food, especially sugars, and then you got excessive stress, which contributes to it, which then leads to poor sleep. So it really is a downward spiral when someone becomes insulin resistant or when they have elevated insulin. What you'll see physically with a person is weight gain, typically around the midsection. So this is something you may want to think of if you feel like you gain weight in the abdominal area and nothing seems to improve it. So maybe you can see also this in friends or family members or in yourself. And I typically see this with people, and I can pretty much tell if they're insulin resistant based on how they carry their weight. And typically that apple shape is more indicative for insulin resistance. So in summary, high levels of insulin cause aches and pains, weight gain, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, mood changes, cancer and aging, hormonal imbalances, and low libido. So let's start with insulin and aches and pains. Insulin is inflammatory in nature, And when you combine this with glycolated end products in the blood, which are essentially molecules that are being produced when you combine simple sugars and fats. So when these accumulate in the blood, it's like fuel on a fire in combination with high insulin levels. And also know that high levels of insulin upregulate the enzyme delta 5 desaturase, which promotes arachidonic acid production. This is the omega-6 fatty acid that causes pain. Insulin and weight gain. So insulin is a fat storage hormone. When sugar doesn't go into a cell because the cells are not listening to the signals from insulin, insulin carries the sugar to the liver instead, where it is converted to fat or triglycerides. This process requires a lot of energy by the body and can therefore lead to fatigue after meals. Also, the cells never got sugar or fuel, so they can't make energy, which causes even more fatigue. And often people not only get tired, but they also crave sweets. So often people who have insulin resistance, they will consistently crave sugary or carbohydrate-rich foods. And so because their cells are expecting these things to come in, but they are not because of the insulin resistance. So insulin also plays a big role in cardiovascular disease, so insulin and blood pressure. Insulin increases sodium retention as well as disrupts sodium-potassium pumps, causing peripheral vascular resistance. So now you have to have increased blood pressure to push through this vascular resistance that the body is experiencing. Keep in mind that insulin also upregulates plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, which causes an increased risk for clotting. So you can see the impact of insulin on someone who is already diagnosed with cardiovascular disease or has cardiovascular disease as a comorbidity associated with insulin resistance. Insulin upregulates HMG-CoA reductase, causing an increase of cholesterol and impacts what is known as cholesterol ester transfer protein, which causes low HDL. And HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors are actually statin medications. So this is why you'll often see people who are diabetics. They are often on a cholesterol-lowering medication when in fact high insulin levels are causing the problem and cholesterol levels to increase in the liver as a result of the high insulin. So we can see here again how insulin can really affect your lipid profile and how your cholesterol and insulin levels are connected. Blood sugar issues can also significantly affect our mood. A meal that is high in carbohydrates causes more insulin release just because of the higher amount of glucose molecules in that meal. And this in turn drives more serotonin into the brain through the blood-brain barrier. And this can contribute to fatigue after meals. So this is just one of the things to look out for. But this is why people crave carbohydrates, to give them a little pick-me-up because of the serotonin drive that takes place, since serotonin is the neurotransmitter that makes us sleepy. And insulin spikes then wear out this mechanism and cause a resistance to serotonin passing through the blood-brain barrier, leading to depression. So a high-carb diet eventually leads to insulin resistance and oftentimes leads to depression because of the neurotransmitter imbalances created. So again, you can see this downward spiral that someone is going through when they become insulin resistant. Insulin also greatly increases our risk for cancer and accelerates aging because insulin is a mitogenic hormone. It promotes cell division. So insulin resistance leads to high levels of sugar in the blood. And that's pretty much what cancer cells love. They love to feed on sugar. That's their energy fuel source. And this contributes to aging, making cells divide faster. And cells can only divide so many times before they can't divide anymore. And this can be measured by something called telomere length. So this is something we can actually measure, and there's been a lot of new research now showing that the length of your telomeres is directly related to the speed at which you age. So that's something to keep in mind. You can literally slow down the aging process by manipulating the hormone insulin. And we can actually say that insulin and stress are the two leading causes of death. People just don't know it because no one ever teaches them about this. But they are fully in your control. So, stress and cortisol are controllable through perception by changing the way we think, and also other variables like meditation and yoga and prayer and so on. But it's also very important to know that insulin is something we can control through our diet. And we're going to talk about how we can manage insulin better and reduce the need for producing insulin in our body. Because, in fact, our hunter gatherer ancestors, they hardly produced any insulin just because their diets were naturally very low in carbohydrates. Hemoglobin A1C measures how fast these cells are dividing. So, hemoglobin can be an indicator of cell oxidation and glycolytic end product, but it also is an indicator how fast our cells are aging. So you can actually literally look at any diabetic who has an A1C above 7.6, and they usually look 10 years older than they really are because they're aging so much faster than the average person is. Hormone imbalances in women. So in women, high levels of insulin upregulate 1720 lyase, causing an increase in testosterone production. So it favors DHEA going in a different direction. Another mechanism is an increase in cytochrome P450 C17, which is a liver enzyme which tells the adrenals and ovaries to produce androgens. So high insulin actually increases the conversion of estrogen to testosterone, but then high testosterone causes even more insulin resistance. And high testosterone in women causes more insulin resistance, as I just said, and so the cycle can wind up. And there's also a decrease in sex hormone binding globulin, which causes more testosterone being exposed to the cells. And so now we're seeing a dramatic imbalance in a woman's hormone levels. And then we also see other symptoms like hair growth, aggressive behavior, mood changes, and changes in body shape are also another thing we need to look out for. And then insulin resistance or high insulin levels can also obviously cause hormonal imbalances in men. And one of the first signs in men is low progesterone. So this is really bad because progesterone actually protects the prostate in men. And insulin upregulates the aromatase enzyme, which is responsible for turning testosterone into estrogen. So in men, the exact opposite happens. They'll start converting testosterone into estrogen, and they are taking on more female characteristics like carrying weight in the hips, but also increase in breast tissue as well, and so on. And this obviously results in reduced libido because testosterone, as we know, increases libido in men. And let's talk about insulin and liver function. Insulin shuts down both phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification in the liver by reducing G6PD, which will decrease cofactors required to produce glutathione. So the liver uses a lot of it, of glutathione, but most of our cells need glutathione all the time in actually quite large amounts. And then how do we actually test for blood sugar issues? So this is important because it's actually all about the right testing. Fasting glucose levels, ideally, or the functional range is 85 to 99, and conventional labs might go as low as 65 all the way up to 125, because remember, they're looking for diabetes and not for dysfunction. Typical liver panel, so we see increased triglycerides, high cholesterol, and high LDL with decreased HDL. And increased triglycerides is one of the early signs from a liver and blood serum point of view. Lactic acid dehydrogenase, when this marker is low, this is a sign of reactive hypoglycemia. So we don't want this lower than 140. So these are people who feel really tired or exhausted after they eat. Mental clarity starts to decrease after they eat, typically an hour afterwards, and they need something with sugar in it or coffee to get them going again. So that's the famous sugar crash in the afternoon that we all probably have experienced. HbA1c, that measures the average blood sugar over the past 120 days, and here 5.6 or less is ideal. And here's a good thing to remember, a good fact: anything above 5.6 and your brain actually ages 50% faster. So keep this in mind from a cellular aging standpoint versus a chronological aging standpoint. And then insulin, this measures your pancreatic output to keep blood sugar low. And obviously, we don't want this too high and we don't want this too low either. So what can we do on our own to help normalize insulin levels? Obviously, lifestyle will make a big difference. You can, or you should, reduce carbohydrate intake and eat a low glycemic index and low glycemic load diet. Walk after meals, so 10 to 15 minutes. That just helps with increasing insulin receptor sensitivity. So exercising and walking are great ways to improve insulin receptor sensitivity. If you're diabetic and you're already checking your blood sugar, check it before you walk and after you walk, and you'll notice that afterwards it'll drop. And that's because your receptor sites became much more sensitive. And resistance training is one of the great ways to improve your receptor site sensitivity as well. Reduce stress. So that's very important because chronic stress in particular, and therefore elevated cortisol, reduce insulin receptor sensitivity and increases inflammation. Eat fresh fiber first. So start every meal with a fresh salad, preferably dark leafy vegetables and other low glycemic vegetables. Avoid food sensitivities and inflammatory foods. So that's a very common issue, and there are a lot of foods that can heighten an immune response by the body, and especially dairy and gluten are contributors to pancreatic diseases, especially type 1 diabetes. And identify nutrient deficiencies and autoimmune disease. And of course, our goal is always to identify nutrient deficiencies because our pancreas relies on nutrients like zinc, for example, in order for it to make insulin. And lastly, it's important to rule out autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes or any other or multiple autoimmune conditions. So there are a lot of things that you can do as a patient, but then on our end as clinicians as well. So thank you very much. If you have any questions about this, then please feel free to email me, lisa@thevitaluinstitute.com, or visit my website and as well as my Facebook page, for I always post new information there. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me on this presentation about insulin and blood sugar metabolism.